So hi everyone, full disclosure, I'm having some interesting camera issues. So if I go off screen, it is nothing personal, it is all technical. So welcome, I'm Evelynn Moon, I'm Director of Education here at Good Grief, and I want to start from a place of gratitude. I'm grateful for the opportunity to spend time with you today. I know we're all pulled in a million different directions, and you taking the time to watch this, whether you're here live now or watching this later on our YouTube channel, is absolutely an honor. Today's session is part of our Good Grief Community webinar series. Every school year, we bring you content, experts, information, and resources, all as a way to extend the work that we do outside of the walls of our centers and into the virtual space. And anyone who has attended today's live session will receive a certificate of attendance within the next 48 hours. So for those of you who are new to Good Grief, we are a nonprofit organization based in New Jersey. Our mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. The way that we do this is through our Nights of Support, our family support services in Morristown, Princeton, and also virtually over Zoom. We have our Good Grief Schools, our Grief Expression Summer Camp. We have our Good Grief Spring Institute. It's coming up this March 18th at the Pingree School. Our focus will be on grief and addiction. We have Dr. Kenneth Doka as our keynote speaker. And What's Your Grief is coming up to do some great workshops. So we hope to see you there. We also provide professional development and training, parent and caregiver education, and we have our Youth and Funerals initiative. But that's enough about Good Grief. I want to talk about our presenter. We have Heather here. She is the principal and founder of the H² group, where she empowers professionals to stop masking their feelings and ignoring their emotions so they can turn that pain into powerful productivity and reset their identity through grief education, coaching, and recovery support. Heather's a tax attorney, advanced grief recovery method specialist, and certified grief and professional diversity coach. She is all the things. And she is also the host of the Grief Unplugged podcast. And here's some fun facts. She enjoys supporting the arts, basking in nature, spa retreats, and being tea to her two nephews. She completed her first sprint triathlon in September of 2022 at age 50. So welcome, Heather. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Evelynn, for the opportunity, and I look forward to sharing with everyone here.
Wonderful. All right, so let me get your slides up. Hi, everyone. I see some hellos in the chat. Hello, hello. So let me share my screen. I will be here to support you in any way you need.
Okay. Thanks, Evelynn. Let's get started. Can you move to the next slide, please? Hi, everyone. We're joining today, and I want to sort of do, Evelynn did a little check-in earlier, but I want to kind of do a check-in as well and ask you, how are you feeling? Think about how you're feeling physically, how you're feeling intellectually, how you're feeling emotionally, and how you're feeling spiritually. Also, think about what brought you to this session and what do you want to take away? I'll give you about 30 seconds to just reflect on those three questions so that we can create an intention for our time together today. Next slide, please. So a couple of things I want us to agree to in this session. Listen actively. Be intentional about listening. Be fully present. Turn off your cell phones, maybe your email, and just be physically present here and fully present. Be curious, be open, and really apply what you learn here today. And I'm going to give a couple of opportunities for us to actually do interactive exercises so that you will have tools to walk away with that you can use for life. Next slide. So this is our journey for the hour. We're going to look at what is identity from a general perspective. We're going to look at what grief is and what it is not. We're going to look at how grief impacts our identity from 3 specific areas: self-awareness, self-compassion, and self-worth, which all build on each other. We're also going to look at the 6 ways grief paralyzes us and the healthy and unhealthy ways that we cope. Then we're going to focus again on the takeaways, how to reset your identity. And then I will open it up for questions. Feel free to add your questions to the Q&A. But I think it would be best to answer all questions at the end, unless there's just something burning. So let's move to the next slide. Identity. Identity is really about what makes you unique. It's a unique set of characteristics used to identify you as a person. It really gives a little bit about a sense of self, really you versus you, not you comparing yourself to others, because comparison is the thief of joy, but who you are. I also want to define what impact is. And what you'll see during this hour is I like to define words a lot, because a lot of times we are socialized to believe that words mean one thing. But if you look in the dictionary, most words have 3 or 4 definitions. So it is vitally important to really look at what words mean and not what we're socialized to believe they mean. So I want to also define impact. Impact is anything having a strong effect on something or someone, or coming into forcible contact with. So grief comes into forcible contact with our identity, and we're going to explore that more today. Next slide. Oh, actually, yeah, next slide, thanks. This is the first interactive exercise that I want to share with you. Please get a piece of paper and make 5 columns on the page. I call this a roles exercise, and when I first experienced this, it was presented to me in a time management, time and productivity mastermind, and it was called a life pruning exercise. But I want to look at it today as a roles exercise. How do you identify? And so when you create these 5 columns, in this first part, because it says part 1, we're going to just fill out the first column. The first column is, what are the roles you play? How do you identify? I'll tell you a couple of things I identify with. I'm a coach. I'm a podcast host. I'm a sister. I'm an aunt. Those are the kind of things I'm looking for. What are the roles you serve in? Or how do you identify? I'm an African-American woman. I'm a native of Louisiana. How do you identify? I want you to list those things in that first column. Just take a minute to do that, because in part 2, later on in the webinar, we will focus on the other 4 categories or columns. But really giving ourselves an opportunity to identify the roles that we have gives us the opportunity to do some self-reflection and determine whether those roles are adding value to us or producing grief. And we'll get into that more later. Next slide. So what is grief? We've defined identity, we've defined impact. What is grief? Grief is a neglected and misunderstood process, because we try to put it in a box. but grief is unique to each of us. We grieve things because we love. And so when you look at it, each of us loves something in a different way, or each of us has a different relationship with a thing, a person, or an event, or an experience. So it is unique to you. Grief is the normal and natural reaction to loss or change. Transition. Anything that changes, anything that we lose, the normal and natural reaction is grief. Grief is also the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or the change in a familiar pattern of behavior. Grief is more than just physical death. And I think that is why it's a neglected and misunderstood process, because, again, it is more than physical death. We experience grief every day. We just don't acknowledge it as that or call it that. But when we actually give an opportunity to experience that, again, we see that grief encompasses pretty much every second of every day, because every second of every day things are changing. Grief is also the feeling of reaching out for someone who has always been there, only to discover when you need them one more time, they're no longer there. It is also the feeling of reaching out for someone who has never been there, only to discover when you need them one more time, they are still not there. Grief is about lingering feelings, meaning you could be grieving something that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, but something will happen in the present that will bring those feelings to the surface. Typically when that happens, it means that there's still some hurt in our hearts. Our hearts haven't healed from what has happened, and there's still some pain there. Grief is about a broken heart. It is not about a broken brain. Typically when we experience grief, the first thing we say is usually, my heart is broken. We don't say our head is broken. So that may be a new concept for people. Grief is also about undelivered communications, meaning there are things that aren't said that can impact our relationship. Or there are things that are said that can impact our relationship. But again, it's about those undelivered communications, those things we hold in, thinking that people can read our mind, when in essence, they can't. It is our responsibility to communicate our wants and our needs. Grief is, as I said, more than physical death. There are like more than 43, and I would say even more than that, life experiences that produce grief, and we will actually go into that in a minute. But I want to just name a few. Divorce, the breakup of a relationship, retirement, moving, the end of an addiction. Grief is also about intangible losses, things we can't touch, like loss of trust, loss of safety, loss of protection, loss of control. There are no stages of grief. I know we hear that a lot, that, hey, I'm trying to go through these 5 stages. There are no 5 stages of grief. The woman that created that, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, created those 5 stages to indicate what a person goes through when they are diagnosed with a terminal illness. So trying to fit yourself into these 5 stages is dangerous. It doesn't lead you back to your identity, who you are. It just sort of puts you in a box. Those stages, again, are for death and dying, not how to process grief. We'll talk about that more. Next slide. So I kind of talked about the life experiences that produce grief. And I want you to just take a look at this slide. I am usually not a person that does death by PowerPoint with all the words on the slide, but I wanted you to just see the vastness of the number of life experiences that produce grief that are beyond physical death. Change in finances. I'll just note that it's an increase in finances also, as well as a decrease in finance, because grief is about the natural emotions that come from change. One of the things that might be interesting to you on this list is that there is grief and loss in organizational change. Yes, loss of housing. Thank you for adding that, Elizabeth. Organizational change is usually not something that people really focus on, or grief at work, but with organizational change comes loss of control, loss of pride, loss of narrative, loss of time, loss of competence, and loss of familiarity. And that's not just those things that are related to organizational change. We can experience those 6 losses that I just described in each of these life experiences that you see here on the slide. So now, next slide, I want to talk about the impact of grief on identity. We're going to focus on 3 specific areas of identity, because there's various components. There's lots of components that we can relate to identity, but we're going to focus on these 3 because I think these 3 are foundational: self-awareness, self-compassion, and self-worth. Next slide. So self-awareness is having a clear understanding of ourselves and our values. And I want to emphasize the word clear, because a lot of times we will have a vague perception of what our values are, or think that we understand who we are. However, without that clear vision, it's very hard to maintain the impact of grief, or to balance ourselves when we experience change, loss, or transition. Some of that, actually, I want to give you a list of values. I meant to include a slide here, but some values may be abundance, acceptance, commitment, connection, security. It's the things that we need that are non-negotiable. I'm trying to get my paper here. Yeah, self-awareness. Values, here's some of the things that actually are part of self-awareness. Self-awareness, we need to understand that we have bias, and not be afraid of the word bias, because bias only means it is our default decision or our default judgment. It is the one thing we go to. Does not mean it's negative or positive. Sometimes we can be unconscious of our bias, but there are other times that we can be conscious of our bias, because again, it is our default behavior. Nothing to be afraid of. In self-awareness, we also need to recognize that we all have privilege. There are certain people that feel they can use that word, and other people who feel they can't use that word. But I want to give you a new perspective on what privilege is today and how it impacts your self-awareness. Privilege is about resources, which is, I think, the one thing everyone sort of relates to privilege, but it doesn't stop there. Privilege is also about life experiences and also exposure. So when you think about it from that perspective, whether you have abundant resources, few resources, we all have life experiences, and we all are exposed to different things. So Everyone has privilege, and I want each of you to walk away from this webinar today with the self-awareness that you have privilege, no matter what your life experience is, your resources, or what you've been exposed to. But also walk away knowing that you can increase your privilege by exposing yourself to things. And thank you for exposing yourself to this webinar to learn that. Values are the things that actually dictate the choices that we make. That is also important to determining self-awareness. Again, it's your non-negotiables. One of the ways to actually have a clear understanding of ourselves is to look at our higher power or our source, because that is our creator. I'll give you an example of how grief impacts self-awareness in my own story. When my mother passed away in 2005, I'm sorry, we were involved in a tragic car accident. I felt like an orphan. Even though my father was still alive, my parents had divorced when I was a junior in college. And I didn't feel that we had a relationship that was something that I could tap into after losing my mother. So I had to realize who I was, or figure out who I was as a person, because my two foundational people in my mind were no longer present with me. I've since, doing this grief work, have come to, we've done, my dad and I have actually done a 180, and we now have the best relationship ever. But until I came into knowing who I was as a person from my source, because your source, again, is your creator, and everything else is a resource. So I had to figure out who I was from my source so that I could be able to tap into my resources, which were my parents. Let's move to the next slide. Self-compassion. Self-compassion is creating yourself with kindness, or treating yourself with kindness, and not beating yourself up for mistakes and shortcomings. Self-compassion has a disparate impact on our identity. And then when you add grief on top of that, it can be very debilitating. With self-compassion, we have to learn to love ourselves. We have to learn to give ourselves rest. And rest is more than just sleep. It's the opportunity to recharge and do things that add joy to our lives, not just happiness, because happiness is fleeting. Self-compassion is also learning how to manage our emotions, which is another way to actually manage grief. We're always taught about emotional intelligence, but I think the emotional intelligence is a body of knowledge, but emotional regulation actually gives us the opportunity to apply that body of knowledge. And that is the thing that helps us to be able to move through the ebbs and flows of life. Self-compassion is actually exercising the power of no, but it is also giving ourselves permission to feel, to grieve. Again, I'll point to a story from my own situation. As a African-American and female, I was always taught that I had to show up with 110%, always doing more than everyone around me. And I got to the point where I was just tired, and I didn't want to actually exert myself to that degree. And so in order to show myself self-compassion or self-love, I started going to restorative yoga. And I never realized, I think I was laying on the mat one day in one of the positions, probably Shavasana. And I felt like, oh no, there was actually mountain pose. And it was interesting that I was standing, but I was so relaxed that if a strong wind had come by, it would have blown me over. And I never realized how amazing it could feel to be standing, yet be so relaxed as to be almost knocked over. And at that moment, I realized, wow, that I had not been loving myself, but that 60 minutes every week that I was giving myself was giving me an opportunity to reflect, to breathe, because I realized that I had just been existing and not fully living. That yoga actually opened me up to be able to then actually go and love myself even more by taking myself to physical therapy to be able to heal an injury that I'd had probably 4 or 5 years and just ignored and allowed the pain to continue in my body. So again, doing things that open you up to loving yourself, giving yourself permission to grieve, to make mistakes, allows us to be able to not let grief overtake us. Let's move to the next slide. Self-worth. Self-worth is the internal sense of being good enough and worthy of love and belonging from others. I want to sort of define what belonging is. It's being appreciated for what you bring to a situation or an event or circle. It's feeling genuine desire from those around you for meaningful relationships. And it's also seeing a genuine appreciation for differences. When I was going through my coach program, we did like a mask exercise. And one of the things I do is I help people to remove their mask and feel their emotions. And on one side, we had to create a two-dimensional mask. On one side of the mask actually showed your face, how you showed up. You had to describe how you showed up to the public. On the opposite side of that, you had to show what you felt inside and actually compare the two. And it wasn't until I did an exercise like that that I really started to realize that my sense of belonging, that I actually had responsibility. It wasn't only the people around me, but I had a responsibility for belonging. And I realized that I was expecting people to engage me and not engage others. And so we have to realize that our self-worth is not solely based on how others treat us, but it's also how we see ourselves. And our self-worth is actually established and developed by self-awareness, knowing who you are and having a clear sense of your values and understanding who you are, but also loving yourself. And recognize also that even if you're a giver, until you are able to receive, there may be more room for you to be more self-compassionate to yourself, because we can only give to the extent that we are open to receiving. That was a new concept for me when I actually heard it, but because I thought I was great because I was a giver. But until I was able to receive, I didn't realize the value of being able to give. Let's move on to the next slide. So 6 ways that grief paralyzes us. And this may be when we feel like we are experiencing an identity crisis. The first thing that paralyzes us is when people tell us not to feel bad. In essence, grief, in essence, what actually happens to us is we don't feel. And we are created for emotion, created for relationships. And so for us to tell ourselves not to feel is not normal, it's not natural. But grief is normal and natural. It's not a sexy word, but it is normal and natural. The second way that grief paralyzes our life is when we try to replace the loss. And in essence, what we're doing is we're failing to acknowledge or accept what has happened when we immediately replace the loss. You can't replace something you love. You can actually, or I will say this, it is harder to accept a new thing if you have not processed what it is that you lost. And I'll give you an example. For example, when a pet dies. Actually, I would say that pet loss is more detrimental than actually losing a human. And the reason I say that is because pets give unconditional love. And that is not always the case with humans. And if you immediately go out and get a new pet without processing the experience you had with the previous pet, it doesn't allow your heart to be able to fully love the new pet. So think about it before you replace the loss. Acknowledge what is no longer present so that you can love what is to come. The next way that grief paralyzes us is trying to grieve alone. And what actually happens is we intentionally isolate. Grief needs to be witnessed. And it needs to be witnessed not necessarily by a large group, but more than just yourself. Recognize that community is just more than you. Find someone safe that you can actually grieve with. And also know that you might have to pay for that support. It may not be somebody that is in your circle. Another way that grief paralyzes us is thinking that time heals all wounds. But what actually happens is time without action keeps us stuck. Time by itself does nothing, because that's where, as I said earlier in the program, lingering feelings come up. Lingering feelings surface because we've waited for time to heal wounds. But we have to really look at our relationships with things and recognize the value it added to us and what we wish was different, better, or more in order to be able to move forward in an emotionally healthy way. We also try to be strong. That is one way that grief paralyzes us. And not necessarily be strong for ourselves, but also being strong for others. And really what we're doing is we're not wearing our oxygen mask when we do that. We know that when we get on planes, we're told, put on your oxygen mask first before you support others. So we've got to support ourselves before we can support others. The last myth that paralyzes us or can cause an identity crisis is keeping busy. And what actually happens there is you're not living, you're just existing. You're not living, you're just existing when you're keeping busy, because when you stop, the pain will still be there. What we resist persists. Let's move on to the next slide. I want to also point out healthy and unhealthy ways that we cope. And these are some of the things that we look to, that I call them short-term energy relieving behaviors, and this comes from the Grief Recovery Institute. But these things, as you look, they are in and of themselves not bad. But when we do them not to feel, they can create dangerous situations in our lives. And I'm sure you can think of others that are there, but food, exercise, those things are not bad in and of themselves. But when they are done not to feel or done in excess, they can paralyze us and they can actually impact our identity instead of actually moving through the grief. A lot of times we want to let go, we want to jump over, but recognize that grief never goes away. We learn how to integrate loss into life. Let's move to the next slide. So how do we reset our identity? Here are some of the things that I think are important in resetting our identity. Number one, processing unresolved grief. You notice on the slide where I showed all of the life experiences that produce grief. Some of those things are still unresolved in your life. However, what we don't recognize is when loss happens, when change happens, when transition happens, we are not the same people, but we try to operate in that same stagnant. It's not that you can't. There has to be some self-reflection to recognize, to bring balance so that you can move forward in an emotionally healthy way. Because if you don't process and you try to replace the loss, you're unbalanced. The goal of being able to not have grief impact your identity is to, again, know who you are, but also be cognizant of the fact that that is a continuous journey. It is an ongoing thing. It is not a one and done. And recognize, I said that grief happens to us every day. Change and loss happens to us every day. So that is how often self-reflection needs to actually take place in order for us to be living from a place of joy, living from a thriving space versus just existing. It is a continuous journey. Another way to reset your identity is to share your story and listen to other people's stories. Because everyone is unique, everyone has a different perspective, and there's the opportunity when grief is witnessed to learn lessons of how to do things better. Another way to reset our identity is to not use the word should, or I should be, or at least, because we are not being honest with ourselves. And one of the things about grief is that we have to be honest, not necessarily about the facts, but how things make us feel, because it is the feeling or the hurt in our heart that is keeping us stuck. Another way to navigate grief or to support others in grief is to ensure that you are in a space, a safe space, where there is no criticism, no analysis or judgment, because that does not allow for you to process grief or to reset your identity. Silence is yet another thing that helps when supporting others in grief. A lot of times we feel like we have to fix things when someone's grieving or when we are grieving. But what about just sitting in silence? Again, that gives you the opportunity to be able to self-reflect, but also not stay in the place of just focusing on the pain. I'm not saying that you have to balance that out with something positive, but balance that out with something that adds value, which may not always be something positive. Also, active listening. A lot of the things that are happening in the world are because people aren't listened to, or they take action so that they can get some attention and be listened to, but usually those are extremes. And so if we were more open, to listening to people and really hearing their heart, and again, maybe not even having a response, but just listening to them. Silence is golden. Again, continuous self-reflection, self-awareness is going to be important in resetting our identity and recognizing that it is ongoing. It is never a one and done. Let's move to the next slide. Here's some things to additionally consider when you're supporting others. Notice when change or loss is a constant topic when you're talking to a person. They may need you to listen more, or they may need additional support. And so one way to address that is to maybe ask a question. How can I support you? Better yet, the better question is, what support do you need? Because if you say, how can I support you? It draws you in, and you may be limited with the support that you can provide to that person. But if you ask a more open question, what support do you need? You may be able to facilitate that additional support for the person. When grief affects basic needs, when someone is not able to actually be functional, that is when maybe an identity reset needs to happen, or they need more support. I want to recognize that misdiagnosis equals mistreatment. And with the next point as well, grief symptoms actually mirror depression. A lot of times we self-diagnose as depressed versus being clinically depressed. However, the symptoms of both grief and depression mirror each other. And I will give you an example: reduced concentration and focus, loss of sleep, change in eating habits. Those are symptoms of grief, but they are also symptoms of depression. And so maybe checking to see, or checking in with your grief to determine whether there's anything unresolved may actually help you not be misdiagnosed. Because maybe you just need someone to listen to you and talk to you versus medication, because medication actually may just mask the pain. And so if you're really grieving, it's hard to sort of build up, pull up that foundation or help those feelings to surface if you are treating them with medication. Just something to think about. Another way to support people is also to refer them out. Everybody in your circle of influence, like your family and your friends, they are maybe not the best people to help you when you are grieving. And so there are grief coaches. There are grief recovery method specialists, and there are therapists. Next slide. I want to actually give a couple of resources here. The Grief Recovery Handbook is a book created by the Grief Recovery Institute, and is also a book I use in facilitating the Grief Recovery Method program. It is a book that helps adults to be able to manage through all types of change and loss, not just physical death. Next slide. The companion book to that also is When Children Grieve, and it is a book that actually helps adults to be able to help children to learn how to manage their emotions now, so that we can have a better world by default. We can have people who feel and who can listen and support others moving forward. Next slide. I want to actually go back to the roles exercise in our last few minutes. And we may not be able to take time to do this, but with the other 4 categories that you have listed, I want you to put these things at the top of those 4 categories. Is the role meaningful? That's in the second column. Meaningful, question mark. Third column, can I ditch this role? Put the word ditch. Can I get rid of it? Next column, can I delegate this? Just write the word delegate. And in the last column, is this something I can do quickly and easily? Right, do quickly, do easily. And I want you to really look at the roles that you've listed. Again, focus on whether it's meaningful, because some of the things that we're doing may be actually adding grief to our lives, which impacts our identity. Figure out whether it's something you can get rid of, or or if there's someone else that can do it, maybe it goes under delegation. But if you can do it more easily and quickly, it's something that you keep. However, I don't want you to just keep it at the same level that it is now, but I want you to be able to evolve in it. Again, there may be some things that you can delegate, even though it is something that you can do quickly and easily. Next slide. I wanted to quickly go through a meditation, learning from our emotions, but I definitely want to be able to answer some questions. So I think the meditation will take about 5 minutes. So what I want you to do is, and then I'll leave the last 5 minutes for questions. What I want you to do is, if you're seated, put your feet on the floor, sit up in your chair, and close your eyes. I invite you to close your eyes. Take a few breaths and ground yourself into your body. Again, put both feet on the floor. Feel the surfaces underneath you that are supporting you. What emotion are you feeling right now? I want you to breathe and let yourself feel the emotion that you are experiencing. With each breath, I want you to feel your body relaxing more and more. Let go of any judgment of the emotion. Let go of any judgment that you have about yourself experiencing this emotion. And with each breath, feel greater acceptance for the emotion. Thank it for being here with you, for it has many lessons to offer. I want you to imagine that this emotion is a guest of yours in a beautiful setting. You're having it over for a cup of tea or your favorite beverage. And you have lots of questions to ask it. And as one of our session agreements, you're also curious to hear what it has to say. Imagine you're with that emotion. What would you like to ask it? I want you to gently engage with it and listen for the answers to these questions. And ask it curiously. What are you doing here? What do you want from me? What do you want me to learn? What are you offering me today? What do you want me to know? What do you want me to show you? What do you want to show me about myself? The time has come for your visit with this emotion to end. And I want you to thank that emotion for coming by. Know that you can always ask your emotions to tea and visit with them. And in a moment, I'll count from 1 to 5. And at the count of 5, when you're ready, you can open your eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I am open for questions if anyone has any at this time. I don't see any in the Q&A. Evelynn, are there any questions that you've noticed in the chat?
No, it was a really engaging chat, though. Folks were sharing resources with each other. They were asking questions. There was a lot of gratitude in there and many, many requests for your slides. And I said I would check in with you before making any promises.
Definitely. You can definitely share the slides. That was my intent in sharing them. Definitely. Because these are always things you can come back to. But I appreciate that. I would love to hear in the chat, what are some of your takeaways? Especially based on the intentions you may have set at the beginning. The role exercise. And also, I didn't mention this, but the meditation that we use can also help to reset your identity as well. That can be something you do daily. Thank you for all of the wonderful comments. Yes, much appreciated. And I think on the last slide, I do have my contact information. And I think you'll be sending that out with the slides as well. And so, yeah, this was definitely an amazing opportunity because for a while, it took me to realize, a long time to realize that grief actually impacted my identity. Because at first I was like, well, it's about relationships. And then I went deeper and it's like, no, my relationships are based on how I show up in them, which again goes back to my identity. So I've got to figure out who I am so that I can make a difference in the world. But also I want everyone to walk away feeling that no matter what happens to you, because change is inevitable, you can change the trajectory of your life with each breath that you have each day.
Well, I put some things in the chat, but it was moving so quickly. I don't know if it got swallowed up. It's so wonderful. I can put it back in there as well, but I just wanted to share with folks. We do have some rescheduling happening. Next month was supposed to be our grief journaling workshop with Dr. Nina Verma. That has been moved to June. So if you have registered for that already, do not worry, it is still happening. Next month, I will be presenting. So yes, so you could see more of Good Grief, learn more about how we approach grief support. And this one will focus on grief after sudden loss. And also we have an in-person event, although going from our chat, not everyone here is from New Jersey, but if you are in the New Jersey area, we'd love to see you Saturday, March 18th at our Good Grief Spring Institute, which will be focused on grief and addiction. We will have Dr. Kenneth Doka there. You might know him as the person who coined the term disenfranchised griefs. That's very exciting. And we will have Lisa Williams and Eleanor Haley of What's Your Grief, who will be there presenting as well in some of our workshops. So it's going to be a really great day. Hope to see some of you there. You will receive an email from us with your certificate of attendance if you were here live. We will also include Heather's contact information, and all of our webinars are recorded and put onto YouTube as well.
Thank you. I appreciate all of the love in the chat. And I'm curious also, what do you wish was different? What can I actually expound on in future webinars? I'm always looking for that as well. And that may be in the surveys. So thank you. Yes, more time. Yes, definitely. I totally agree with that, Kim. But thank you again for the opportunity, Evelynn. And I appreciate the community that you've developed and how you all show up in the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather. We appreciate you being part of our community webinars and being part of our Good Grief community now. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today. We appreciate your time, your attention. We hope to see you at future sessions, and we will be in touch. So take care, everyone, and be well.